Close your eyes. This is a story designed to help you sleep. Tonight, you are a courier on the Silk Road. The year is 1347. You have carried secrets from Samarkand to Antioch, from Baghdad to the Black Sea. But tonight, sitting beside a dying campfire under a river of stars, you speak your final confession. You are about to unburden yourself of a secret that has been hidden in the lining of your saddlebag for 30 years. But first, let yourself be completely at ease. Breathe in slowly, and out. Let the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the desert wind become the only sounds. There is nothing to solve right now. Just let the story unfold, as you drift deeper into rest. The fire was the only thing between you and the dark. It was not a large fire. It had never been meant to be. Just a few sticks of dry acacia wood, gathered from the wadi earlier that afternoon when the sun was still high and the shadows were still short. You had walked along the dry riverbed, your sandals sinking into the soft sand, picking up pieces of wood that the last flash flood had carried down from the hills. Each piece was bleached white by the sun, light as bone, and they had crackled eagerly when you fed them to the flames. Now, hours later, they were burning down to embers. The flames had shrunk to small, licking tongues of orange and blue, curling around the blackened wood like fingers testing the edge of something hot. The fire crackled softly. Now and then, a pocket of sap burst with a small, sharp snap, sending a single spark spiraling up into the vast, cold air. The spark would rise for a moment, bright and brave, and then fade into nothing against the immense darkness of the sky. You pulled the old wool blanket tighter around your shoulders. It was worn thin in places, the fibers loosened by years of wind and sand and the rough hands of the weaver who had made it long ago. You could not remember where you had acquired it. Somewhere between Samarkand and Bukhara, perhaps. Or in the market at Tabriz, traded for a handful of dried figs and a small copper coin. It did not matter anymore. It was warm enough. And tonight, warmth was all you needed. The blanket smelled of camel and wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of the desert at night, a smell that you had known for so long that it no longer registered as a smell at all, but simply as the background of your life. The desert stretched away on every side, silent and silver under the moon. The dunes rose and fell like waves on a frozen sea, their crests touched with pale light, their troughs filled with shadow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. There was no wind. The air was so still that you could hear the sand settling, grain by grain, as if the earth itself was breathing in its sleep. A small beetle, black and shiny, crawled across the sand near your foot, pausing now and then as if listening to something only it could hear. Overhead, the sky was a river of stars, so many stars, so bright, that they seemed to press down on the world with their quiet, patient weight. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon like a bridge of light, and you could pick out the familiar constellations that the caravan guides had taught you when you were still a boy. The camel, the scales, the river. They had been there when you first left Samarkand. They would be there long after you were gone. You had slept under this sky more nights than you could count. It had become a kind of home. The only home you had left. The cities of your youth, Samarkand with its blue domes, Bukhara with its honey-colored walls, Constantinople with its spires and its harbors, were far away now, separated from you by years and miles and the slow accumulation of memories that you no longer had the strength to sort through. Here, in the desert, there was only the fire and the stars and the quiet. And that was enough. It had always been enough. Your camel lay a few paces behind you, her legs folded beneath her, her long neck curved down toward the sand. She was old, like you. Her coat had turned gray around her muzzle, and her lashes were long and pale. She had carried you across the Hindu Kush and through the Dashti Kavir and over the high passes of the Pamirs, where the air was so thin that every breath felt like a small, sharp blade. She had waited for you outside the walls of Antioch while you delivered a letter that you were not supposed to read. She had knelt in the snow at the foot of Mount Ararat while you sheltered in a cave with a family of Armenian merchants who shared their bread and their stories. Now, she slept. Her breathing was slow and steady, a soft, rhythmic wheeze that had become as familiar to you as your own heartbeat. Every now and then, one of her ears would twitch, as if she was dreaming of the road. You had been a courier for most of your life. Not the kind that carried letters from one prince to another, sealed with wax and wrapped in silk. No, you had carried other things. Coins. Jewels. Small bags of saffron and pepper and cinnamon that were worth more than their weight in gold. And, sometimes, secrets. Secrets that were never written down, that lived only in your memory, that you carried from one city to another like a flame cupped in your hands against the wind. You had carried them for so long that you had stopped thinking of them as secrets. They had become part of you, woven into the fabric of who you were, until you could no longer tell where the secret ended and your own soul began. But tonight, you were tired. Not the tiredness of a long day on the road, the kind that a good meal and a night's sleep could cure. This was a deeper tiredness. The kind that settled into your bones and made them heavy. The kind that whispered to you, in the quiet hours before dawn, that the road was coming to an end. You had been walking it for more than 60 years. You had seen empires rise and fall. You had seen fortunes made and lost in the space of a single trading season. And you had kept your secrets through all of it. But tonight, you wanted to let one of them go. The fire snapped again. A small, sharp sound that seemed to hang in the still air for a moment before fading. It was as if the fire itself was urging you on, encouraging you to speak. You looked down at your hands. They were old hands now, the skin loose over the knuckles, the veins standing out like cords. But they could still remember the weight of the things they had carried. You reached down beside you, your fingers brushing against the worn leather of your saddlebag. It had been with you almost as long as the camel. Its surface was cracked and faded, the stitches holding it together replaced more times than you could remember, sometimes with leather cord, sometimes with sinew, once with a length of silk thread that a Persian woman in Tabriz had given you after you delivered a letter to her that she had been waiting 10 years to receive. You opened the flap and slid your hand inside, feeling past the spare tinderbox and the bundle of dried dates wrapped in cloth, past the small knife with the bone handle and the worn whetstone, until your fingers found what they were looking for. A small leather pouch. No larger than your palm. It was warm from the heat of your body, the leather smooth and soft from years of being carried against your skin, hidden beneath your robes, pressed close to your heart. You had worn it on a cord around your neck for the first 10 years. Then, when the cord broke, you had tucked it into the inner pocket of your robe. Then, when the robe wore out, you had moved it to the saddlebag. But you had never let it out of your sight. Not once. Not in 30 years. The pouch was sealed with wax. The wax was old, darkened to the color of old honey, and it had cracked slightly along the edges from years of heat and cold and the constant, gentle pressure of being carried. You turned it over in your fingers. The leather was warm and smooth, almost alive. 30 years. 30 years you had carried this pouch, and never once had you broken the seal. Ad thought about it, of course. On long nights when the road was empty and the wind was howling, you had held it in your hands and wondered. But you had always put it back. You had made a promise. And you were a man who kept his promises. But tonight was different. Tonight, the fire was low, and the stars were bright, and the desert was silent. Tonight, you wanted to speak. Your thumb found the edge of the wax seal and pressed against it, gently, testing its strength. The wax crumbled. A small piece fell away, landing on the sand beside your foot. Then another. You worked your thumb around the rim of the pouch, loosening the seal, until the opening was free. The wax fell away in small, brittle fragments, and for the first time in 30 years, the pouch was open. You tipped it over your palm. Something small and heavy slid out and landed with a soft, metallic weight. A coin. A gold coin. It caught the firelight, glowing with a deep, warm luster that seemed almost alive. You turned it over in your fingers, feeling its weight, its smoothness, the crispness of its edges. It had been well made. The gold was pure, the strike deep and even. But it was not like any coin you had seen in the bazaars of Samarkand, or the money changers' stalls in Constantinople, or the counting houses of Venice, or the caravanserais of Isfahan. The symbol on its face was a circle, and inside the circle was a key. Not a real key, an engraving of one, small and precise, with a bow shaped like a crescent moon and a shaft that ended in 3 delicate teeth. Beneath the key, there were letters. They were not in Persian, not in Arabic, not in any script you recognized. You held the coin closer to the fire, tilting it so that the light played over the engraving, deepening the shadows in the grooves. The key seemed to stare back at you, patient and silent, as if it had been waiting a very long time for someone to look at it. You had carried this coin for 30 years. You did not know where it came from. You did not know what it opened. But you had always known, somewhere deep in the quiet part of your mind, that someday you would have to find out. And tonight, under the river of stars, with the fire dying at your feet and the desert breathing around you and the old camel sleeping behind you, felt like the night to begin. The fire crackled softly, a familiar sound in the vast silence of the desert. You watched the flames curl around the dry acacia wood, their orange tongues licking at the darkness. The gold coin still rested in your palm, warm from the heat of your hand. Its strange symbol, the key inside the circle, seemed to glow in the firelight. And as you looked at it, your mind drifted back. Back across the years, across the mountains and the salt deserts and the winding passes. Back to Samarkand. You had been 14 years old. Samarkand in those days was a city of blue domes and crowded bazaars, of merchants who spoke a dozen languages and sold goods from the far corners of the earth. The air in the market was thick with the smell of spices, cinnamon and cardamom and saffron, and the sound of haggling rose and fell like the voice of the sea. You were not a merchant's son. Your father had been a scribe, a quiet man who spent his days bent over a writing desk, copying letters and contracts for traders who could not write their own names. He had taught you to read and write before he died, not just Persian, but Arabic and a little Chinese, enough to recognize the characters if not to understand them. It was a rare skill. Rarer than you knew. The afternoon the caravan master found you, you were sitting on the steps of a mosque near the Registan, watching the crowd. You were not begging. You were not looking for work. You were simply there, a thin boy with dusty feet and ink-stained fingers, waiting for nothing in particular. The caravan master was a tall man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much sun. He walked through the market with the slow, deliberate stride of someone who had crossed more deserts than he could count. When he saw you, he stopped. "Can you write?" he asked. His voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together. You nodded. "My father taught me." He reached into his robe and pulled out a scrap of paper and a piece of charcoal. "Write your name, H.S. Aid." You did. Then he dictated a few lines, a simple record of a transaction, dates and amounts and the names of 2 merchants. You wrote it all down, your hand steady despite your pounding heart. He took the paper from you, studied it for a long moment, and then folded it into his sleeve. "You'll do," he said. "Be at the eastern gate at dawn. Bring nothing but your hands." That was how you joined the caravan. Not as a guard, not as a camel driver, but as a scribe. Your job was to keep the records. But not the records that were shown to the tax collectors at the city gates, or the officials who inspected the goods at the caravanserais. Those records were kept by the chief merchant, a fussy Persian with ink-stained fingers like yours. No, your job was different. Your job was to keep the shadow ledger. The caravan master explained it to you on the 3rd night, as you sat beside a fire much like this one. He handed you a small leather-bound book, its pages blank and white. "Everything we trade officially goes in the chief merchant's books," he said. "But not everything we carry is official. Some of it belongs to people who cannot afford to have their names known. Some of it is meant for people who are not supposed to receive it. You will keep a record of those things. You will tell no one. You will show the book to no one unless I tell you to. Do you understand?" You nodded. You were 14 years old. You understood very little. But you understood that this man had chosen you, not for your strength, not for your speed, but for your hands and your mind. And that was something you had never been chosen for before. The shadow ledger became your responsibility. Every few days, the caravan master would come to you with a new entry. Sometimes it was a bag of coins delivered to a widow in a village whose name you never learned. Sometimes it was a bundle of silk given to a young couple who had no money for a dowry. Sometimes it was stranger, a small locked box carried from one city to another, handed to a man who asked no questions and gave no name. Each transaction was recorded in your ledger, in the careful, precise handwriting your father had taught you. The amounts were always modest. The reasons were never explained. And then, one night, the caravan master came to you with something different. He opened the ledger to the very first page, the page you had left blank, thinking it was meant for a title or a dedication. He took a pen from his sleeve and wrote, in his own hand, a single name and a single number. The ink was dark and wet. It glistened in the firelight. If anyone in the caravan ever asks for this name, he said, show them the book. If no one asks, keep it hidden. Do you understand? You looked at the name. It meant nothing to you. You looked at the number. It was larger than any single entry you had ever recorded. What is it? You asked. The caravan master was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled between you. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than you had ever heard it. This is not one man's wealth, he said. It is the ransom of a city. He did not explain further. He closed the ledger, pressed it back into your hands, and walked away into the dark. You sat alone beside the fire, the book heavy in your lap, the name and the number burning in your mind like the embers at your feet. You did not know it then, but that was the moment your life changed. That was the moment you stopped being a boy who wrote down numbers and started being a courier who carried secrets. And you would carry them for the rest of your life. The fire had burned lower now, the embers pulsing with a soft, rhythmic glow that seemed to match the slow beating of your heart. The gold coin lay in your palm, its strange symbol catching the last light of the flames. But your mind was no longer in the present. It was traveling back across the years, back to the nights when your hands were young and the ledger was new and the world seemed as wide as the desert sky above you. The old camel shifted in her sleep, her breathing a deep, steady wheeze, and a soft gust of wind stirred the sand at your feet, carrying with it the faint, dry scent of sagebrush. You had kept the shadow ledger for 3 years before you began to understand what it really was. It started in Merv, a green oasis city on the edge of the Karakum desert. Your caravan had arrived at dusk, the camels weary and the men wearier. The sun was sinking behind the mud brick walls, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, and the call to prayer echoed across the rooftops like a thread of sound stitching the city together. You had barely finished unloading the packs when there was a soft knock on the door of the small room you had rented above a pottery workshop. It was not a loud knock. Just 3 soft taps, spaced evenly, as if the person on the other side did not want to be heard. You opened the door. A woman stood in the shadows of the hallway. She was dressed in the plain, dark clothing of a widow, and her face was half hidden by her veil. She did not give her name. She did not explain who she was or how she knew where to find you. She simply held out a small leather pouch, heavy with coins, and spoke a single sentence. The name is in the book. Mark it as received. Then she was gone. Her footsteps faded down the stone stairs, and the door at the bottom of the stairwell opened and closed with a soft click. You stood there for a long moment, the pouch in your hand, the silence pressing in around you. Then you sat down at the rough wooden table, lit a candle, and opened the ledger. The name was there. It was one of the earliest entries, a name the caravan master had dictated to you on a night much like this one, years ago. You dipped your pen in the inkwell, and in the careful, precise hand your father had taught you, you wrote the amount she had given you, and the date, and the city, Merv. And that was all. That was how it worked. After Merv, it happened again. And again. In Bokhara, beneath the great Kalan minaret that rose like a stone finger pointing toward heaven, a Jewish merchant came to your tent at midnight. The streets were empty and silent, and the only sound was the distant barking of a dog somewhere in the labyrinth of alleyways. He did not speak. He simply pressed a small bundle of raw silk into your hands, its fibers soft and cool, and pointed to a name in the ledger. You nodded, and he slipped away into the dark as quietly as he had come. In Tabriz, an Armenian monk found you in the crowded market, where the air was thick with the smell of roasting lamb and the shouts of copper sellers hammering their wares. He slipped a folded piece of paper into your sleeve without a word. On it was written a name and a number. You checked the ledger later that evening, alone in your room with the lamp flickering beside you. The name matched. You recorded the number. In Constantinople, it was a Greek doctor who approached you outside the great church of Hagia Sophia. The city was a maze of domes and minarets, of merchants speaking Greek and Latin and Arabic, of ships crowding the Golden Horn like a forest of masts. He wore a long black robe and carried a leather satchel filled with vials and herbs. He handed you a small purse of gold coins and asked you, in a voice barely above a whisper, to mark his brother's debt as paid. You found the name in the ledger, written 3 years earlier, and drew a line through it with a careful stroke of your pen. In Aleppo, it was a blind storyteller who sat in the corner of a coffee house, his voice rising and falling as he recited the ancient epics of kings and heroes. The air was thick with the smell of cardamom coffee and the murmur of men playing backgammon. He could not see you, but he knew you were there. When you passed by his cushion, he reached out and pressed a single silver coin into your palm. "For the boy in Damascus," he said, and then he returned to his story as if nothing had happened. In Gaza, it was a child, a boy no older than 10, barefoot and dusty, who ran up to you in the street and pressed a single gold coin into your hand before disappearing into the crowd. You never learned his name. Each time, you recorded the transaction. Each time, the name was already in the book. And each time, you began to understand a little more. This was not just a record of debts and payments. It was a network. A web of trust that stretched from the blue-domed cities of Samarkand the canals of Venice, from the caravanserais of Persia to the synagogues of Al-Andalus. The people who came to you were not merchants. They were relatives. Refugees. People who had fled one city and needed to send money to someone in another city, without the risk of carrying gold across bandit-infested roads. The caravan master, and now you, his scribe, were the bridge. You carried the credits. You recorded the payments. You kept the secrets. The ledger was the key. It was the only place where all the names and all the amounts were written down. Without it, the network was just a collection of whispers and handshakes. With it, it was a bank. An invisible bank, with no walls and no vaults, whose currency was trust and whose depositors were the forgotten. The fire crackled again, and a single ember rose into the air, glowing bright orange for a brief moment before fading into the darkness above you. You watched it disappear, and your eyes drifted back to the gold coin in your hand. The symbol on its face, the key inside the circle, seemed to grow sharper in the flickering light, as if it was trying to tell you something. And then you remembered the page. The page in the middle of the ledger that was folded at the corner. You had not thought about it in years. But now, sitting beside the dying fire with the coin warm against your skin, you could see it clearly. It was a single page, set apart from all the others. It recorded only one transaction. The date was 1337. The amount filled the entire page, a number so large that it had taken you 3 lines to write it, each digit formed with the same steady hand you had used for all the others. And in the margin, in the caravan master's own hand, were 2 words in Persian, the Black Sea. You had never learned what that transaction was. You had never asked. The caravan master had not offered an explanation, and you had been young enough then to accept that some secrets were not meant for you. But you had folded the corner of that page, 30 years ago, because you knew, somewhere deep in the quiet part of your mind, beneath the numbers and the names and the endless rhythm of the road, that someday you would need to find out. And tonight, under the river of stars, with the fire dying at your feet and the desert breathing around you and the old camel sleeping behind you, you felt that day had finally come. The coin was in your hand. The page was in your memory. And the Black Sea was waiting. The fire had burned low, and the desert silence was so complete that you could hear the soft settling of the sand beneath your blanket. The gold coin rested in your palm, its strange symbol catching the last of the firelight. The old camel shifted in her sleep, a soft grunt escaping her lips, and for a moment the sound pulled you back from the edge of memory. But then the fire snapped, a small sharp crack that echoed in the stillness, and your mind drifted again. Back across the years, back across the mountains, to the city of Tabriz, and to the day you almost died. Tabriz was a city of dust and commerce. Its great bazaar stretched for miles beneath vaulted brick ceilings, a labyrinth of alleys and courtyards where merchants from every corner of the world gathered to trade. The air was thick with the smell of turmeric and cumin and the sharp, metallic tang of copper being hammered into pots. The sound of haggling rose and fell like the voice of the sea, Persian and Arabic and Turkish and Armenian, all mixing together into a single, endless hum. You had arrived with the caravan at dawn, the camels blinking in the pale morning light, their breath steaming in the cold air. By midday you were deep in the market, carrying the ledger wrapped in a piece of oilcloth beneath your robe. You had an entry to record, a payment from a silk merchant to his brother in Aleppo, and you were looking for the man who would make it. You never found him. What you found instead was a knife. It happened fast. One moment you were walking through the spice market, your eyes scanning the crowd for the face of your contact. The next moment, a hand grabbed your collar from behind and pulled you into a narrow alley between 2 stalls. The world tilted, and you felt the cold edge of a blade press against your ribs, just below the heart. A voice hissed in your ear, harsh, guttural, speaking a dialect you did not recognize. The words were foreign, but the meaning was clear. He wanted the book. He knew had you carried. You did not give it to him. Something inside you, something that had been growing since the night the caravan master first placed the ledger in your hands, refused. Instead, you twisted your body, felt the knife slice across your side in a sudden, searing line of fire, and ran. The pain came a moment later, sharp and hot, spreading through your body like ink through water. But you did not stop. You clutched the ledger to your chest with both arms and ran through the maze of alleys, your sandals slapping against the hard-packed earth, your breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind you, the shouts of your pursuer grew fainter, swallowed by the noise of the bazaar. Blood was soaking through your robe now, warm and wet against your skin. Your vision was beginning to blur at the edges, the walls of the alley swaying as if they were underwater. You turned a corner and found yourself in a dead end, a small, sunlit courtyard behind a row of workshops. The ground was wet with runoff, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of chemicals. Great stone vats stood in rows, filled with dye, indigo blue, madder red, saffron yellow, their surfaces shimmering with oily rainbows. Lengths of fabric hung from wooden racks above your head, dripping color onto the packed earth floor. There was a door at the far end of the courtyard. You pushed through it and stumbled inside. The workshop was dark and hot, filled with steam that rose from the dye vats and clung to your skin. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of fermented indigo and something sharper, like vinegar. In the center of the room, her arms stained to the elbow in deep blue, was a woman. She was not young, and she was not old. Her hair was covered with a plain cotton scarf, and her face was lined but not worn. Her eyes were dark and steady, and when she looked at you, at the blood spreading across your robe, at the ledger clutched against your chest, she did not scream. She did not call for help. She simply set down the fabric she was holding, walked to the door, and slid the heavy wooden bolt shut. Then she turned back to you. "Sit," she said. Her voice was calm, unhurried. The voice of someone who had seen worse things than a wounded stranger. You sat on a low wooden stool. She knelt beside you and gently pulled back the torn fabric of your robe. The cut was long, a diagonal gash across your ribs, but the knife had not gone deep. It had sliced the skin but missed anything vital. She examined it for a moment, her stained fingers careful and precise, and then she stood and walked to a shelf in the corner. When she returned, she carried a roll of clean linen and a small clay pot of ointment. That smelled of honey and herbs. She worked in silence. Her hands moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before, who had bandaged wounds before, who had helped strangers before, who had asked no questions and expected no answers. The ointment stung for a moment, and then the pain began to recede, replaced by a cool, spreading numbness. You watched her as she worked, and you felt something you had not felt in a long time. Safety. Brief, fragile, but real. When the bandage was in place, she helped you to your feet. The bleeding had stopped. Your head was clearer now. She led you to the back of the workshop, where a rough wooden ladder leaned against the wall. It led upward, through a square opening in the ceiling, to the roof. "Go," she said. "The roofs connect. You can reach the caravanserai without going back through the streets. The man who attacked you will still be looking." You paused at the foot of the ladder. You did not know how to thank her. You did not even know her name. But as you turned to go, you saw her glance at the ledger, still clutched against your chest. Her eyes moved over its blood-stained cover, the leather now dark and slick with your blood, and something flickered in her expression. Recognition. Understanding. A quiet, wordless acknowledgement that passed between you like a breath. If your eyes are growing heavy, if the rhythm of the fire is beginning to blur the edges of your thoughts, then let them. The rooftops of Tabriz will still be there when you wake. The woman in the dying workshop will still be there. The story will hold its place, patient and still, until you are ready to open your eyes again. You climbed the ladder. The rooftops of Tabriz stretched before you, a flat, sun-baked landscape of clay and timber, interrupted here and there by the dome of a mosque or the minaret of a prayer tower. You crossed them carefully, stepping from one roof to the next, until you reached the caravanserai on the far side of the bazaar. By the time you climbed down into the courtyard, the bleeding had stopped entirely, and the woman in the dying workshop had already begun to fade from your mind, just another stranger on the long road, just another face in the endless procession of cities and caravans. It was not until weeks later that you discovered what she had done. You were sitting in a caravanserai in Erzurum, a rough stone fortress on the edge of the Anatolian plateau. The wind was howling outside, rattling the shutters, and a small fire burned in the hearth. The ledger was open on your lap, and you were reviewing the entries from the past month, checking the numbers against your memory. And then you saw it. On the page that had been soaked with your blood, now dried to a dark, rust-colored stain that spread across the paper like a map of some unknown country, there was a line of writing that was not yours. It was in Persian. Written in a delicate, feminine hand. The ink was a deep black, fresh and clean, standing out sharply against the faded brown of the older entries and the darker brown of the bloodstain. Received. Debt cleared. You stared at those words for a long time. The wind moaned outside, and the fire crackled in the hearth, and the other travelers in the caravanserai talked and laughed and played their games of dice. But you heard none of it. You were thinking about the woman in Tabriz. You did not know when she had written those words. Perhaps while you were climbing the ladder. Perhaps while you were still sitting on the floor of her workshop, dizzy with blood loss, your eyes half closed. But she had seen the ledger. She had recognized a name, perhaps her husband's, perhaps her brother's, perhaps her own. And she had marked it as paid. You never learned her name. You never saw her again. But from that day on, you understood something that you had not understood before. The network was not just the caravan master. It was not just you. It was everyone. Every city along the Silk Road had someone who had been helped by the shadow ledger. Every caravanserai had a door that would open. Every rooftop had a ladder that would appear. Every stranger in a dying workshop would ask no questions and expect no payment. You were not alone. You had never been alone. And neither were the people whose names were written in your book. The fire was little more than embers now, a bed of glowing coals that pulsed with a soft, orange light, like the slow breathing of some ancient creature sleeping beneath the sand. The desert around you was silent and vast, the dunes stretching away under the moon like waves on a frozen sea, their crests touched with silver, their troughs filled with shadow. You had been sitting here for hours, the gold coin warm in your palm, letting the memories wash over you like water, some gentle, some fierce, all of them carrying you back across the years to places you had not seen in decades. And now, as you turned the coin over in your fingers, feeling the raised edge of the key symbol against your thumb, your mind drifted back to Constantinople. To the city of domes and spires. To the gold you had carried there, and to the man who had received it. You had been on the road for nearly 4 months. The journey had taken you across the Anatolian plateau, a vast, windswept highland where the grass was short and brown and the sky seemed to stretch forever. You had traveled through mountain passes where the wind cut like a blade, whipping through the narrow gaps with a sound like 1,000 voices crying out at once. You had descended into valleys where the sun beat down with relentless force, the heat shimmering off the rocks in waves that made the camels blink and snort. You had crossed rivers on makeshift rafts, your heart pounding as the current tugged at the logs beneath your feet. You had slept in caves and in shepherds' huts and once, for 3 nights straight, under nothing but the open sky, the stars wheeling slowly overhead as the gold lay hidden beneath your saddle. You had traveled with a small group, just 3 camels and 2 guards, because the cargo you carried was too valuable to risk in a larger caravan. Gold. Not yours. It had been gathered by merchants in the East, men who had contributed small amounts over many months, pooling their resources like tributaries feeding a great river. Each of them had given what they could spare, a handful of coins, a small bar, a few pieces of jewelry melted down and reshaped, for a purpose that had never been fully explained to you. Your job was simply to deliver it. To carry it across the mountains and the plains, to keep it safe from bandits and tax collectors and 1,000 other dangers that lurked along the Silk Road, and to place it in the hands of the person it was meant for. The secret routes you took were not marked on any map. They had been shown to you by the caravan master years ago, traced on the back of an old piece of leather with a piece of charcoal that left dark smudges on your fingers. Mountain paths that wound through the high passes like the tracks of a snake, avoiding the main roads where bandits waited in the shadows of the rocks. River crossings that could only be made at certain times of year, when the water was low and the current slow enough to ford. You had traveled these routes before, but never with a cargo so precious. Each night, you slept with the gold hidden beneath your saddle, your hand resting on the hilt of your knife, your ears tuned to every sound in the darkness. Constantinople rose before you on a gray morning in late autumn. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but had not yet released it. You had seen many cities in your life, Samarkand with its blue domes, Bokhara with its honey-colored walls, Tabriz with its dusty bazaars, but none like this. Its walls were immense, rising from the hills like the sides of a great stone ship, and beyond them you could see the domes of churches and the minarets of mosques, the spires of palaces and the smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys. The Golden Horn glittered in the pale sunlight, crowded with ships from every corner of the world, Venetian galleys with their striped sails, Genoese merchantmen with their high prows, Arab dhows with their lateen rigs. The air smelled of salt and smoke and spices, and the sound of the city was a low, constant roar that you could hear from miles away, a sound like the sea, like the wind, like the voice of the world itself. You found the Jewish doctor in a narrow street near the harbor, in a house that was unmarked and unremarkable. It was a modest dwelling, its wooden shutters closed against the damp air, its stone doorstep worn smooth by the feet of countless visitors. You had been told how to find it by a contact in the city, a spice merchant with a scar across his cheek who had met you at the docks and spoken to you in a low, hurried voice. The doctor lived in the Jewish quarter, he said, near the old synagogue. You would know the house by the small brass lamp that burned in the window, even during the day. The lamp was there, its flame flickering behind a pane of dusty glass. You knocked on the door. It opened a crack, and a pair of dark, intelligent eyes regarded you from the shadows within. "You have something for me," the voice said. It was not a question. You nodded. The door opened wider, and the doctor stepped back to let you enter. He was an old man, older than anyone you had ever seen. His hair was white and thin, combed back from a high forehead that was lined with the deep furrows of age. His hands, when he reached out to take the bags from you, trembled slightly, not with weakness, but with the kind of tremor that comes from a lifetime of delicate work. He had been a physician for more than 50 years, you would later learn. He had treated princes and paupers, soldiers and scholars, and he had asked for payment only from those who could afford it. The others, he treated for free. He did not count the gold. He did not weigh it or test it. He simply placed the bags on a low wooden table and looked at them for a long moment, his hands resting on either side of the pile. The room was dark, lit only by the lamp in the window and a small fire burning in the hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the air smelled of old books and medicinal herbs and the faint, clean scent of beeswax. "This will free him," the doctor said at last. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "The scholar. He has been imprisoned for 3 years. His only crime was teaching what the authorities did not want taught. He wrote about the movement of the stars, about the nature of light, about the possibility that the earth was not the center of all things. For this, they put him in a cell so small he could not lie down. With this gold, I can pay his ransom." You did not know the scholar. You had never heard his name. But as you stood there in the dim light of the doctor's house, watching the old man's hands rest on the bags of gold, you understood something that you had not understood before. The gold was not just metal. It was not just weight and purity and value, not just something to be counted and recorded and locked away. It was a key. A key that could open a door that had been locked. A key that could set a man free. The caravan master had told you, on that first night when he wrote the name and the number in the ledger, that the entry was the ransom of a city. You had not understood then what he meant. You were beginning to understand now. Before you left, the doctor stopped you. He reached for your hand, his fingers were cool and dry, the skin papery with age, and held it for a long moment. He looked at you, and there was something in his eyes that you could not name. Gratitude, perhaps. Or recognition. Or the quiet acknowledgement of one who understood what it meant to carry secrets across the world. Then, with his other hand, he worked a ring from his own finger and pressed it into your palm. It was a simple silver band, worn smooth by years of wear. The metal was warm from his skin. Inside the band, engraved in tiny, precise letters, were 2 characters in Hebrew and a small symbol. You held it up to the light of the fire. The symbol was a key. The same key that was stamped on the gold coin you had carried for 30 years. Take this, the doctor said. If someone comes to you one day, wearing a ring that matches this one, help them. It does not matter if you have the ledger or not. It does not matter if you know their name. Help them. You will know them by this ring. You slipped the ring onto your finger. It fit as if it had been made for you, not too tight, not too loose, the silver cool against your skin. You looked at it for a long moment, and then you looked back at the doctor. But he had already turned away, his attention returned to the bags of gold on the table, as if you were already gone. You let yourself out. The narrow street was empty, the brass lamp still burning in the window. The clouds had begun to break apart, and thin shafts of pale sunlight were slanting down through the gaps, illuminating the rooftops and the domes and the distant spires of the city. You walked back toward the harbor, the ring on your finger, the weight of what you had just witnessed settling into your chest like a stone dropped into still water. You had carried gold across the world. You had recorded thousands of transactions in the shadow ledger. But this was the first time you had seen, with your own eyes, what the money could do. It could open a door. It could set a man free. And the ring on your finger was a promise that wherever you went, whoever you met, you would be part of something larger than yourself. You are still wearing that ring now, as you sit beside the dying fire, watching the embers pulse and fade. The gold coin is in one hand. The ring is on the other. Both bear the same symbol. Both have been waiting 30 years for you to understand. See what they mean. And tonight, under the river of stars, you are beginning to. The fire was almost gone now, and the desert cold was beginning to creep in around the edges of your blanket. You pulled the wool tighter across your shoulders, feeling the familiar ache in your bones, the ache of a long life, of miles walked and burdens carried. The gold coin lay in your palm, its symbol still catching the last of the ember light. But your mind was traveling back again, back across the years, to a night much colder than this one, and to the last conversation you ever had with the caravan master. He was dying. Everyone in the caravan knew it. He had been ill for weeks, a cough that started as a dry scratch in his throat and deepened into something wet and rattling that kept him awake at night and weakened him during the day. The doctors in Damascus had done what they could, bleeding him and giving him herbs and praying over him in 3 different languages, but nothing helped. By the time the caravan reached the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, he could no longer ride. The men had to carry him on a litter between 2 camels, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes fixed on the sky as if he was already watching himself leave it. He called for you on the last night. His tent had been pitched apart from the others, as it always was, and a small fire burned at its entrance. The flames were low and blue at the base, the wood having been gathered hastily from the sparse mountain scrub. You knelt beside his bed, a simple pallet of blankets and cushions, and waited. His breathing was slow and labored. Each inhale seemed to cost him something. But his eyes, when they found you, were still sharp. Still clear. The eyes of the man who had first seen you sitting on the steps of a mosque in Samarkand, a lifetime ago. "I have something to give you," he said. His voice was barely a whisper, dry as the desert wind. "Something I should have given you long ago." He gestured toward a small chest at the foot of his bed. You opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of Fa. Dead silk, was a key. Not a metal key, not the kind that opened doors in the walls of cities or the locks of treasure chests. This key was made of bone. It was small, no longer than your thumb, and carved with intricate designs that seemed to shift and change as you turned it in the firelight. Flowers. Stars. A crescent moon. The carvings were so fine that you could feel each one beneath your fingertip, delicate as a vein on a leaf. Open the saddlebag, he said. The old one. The one I have carried since before you were born. You had seen that saddlebag 1,000 times. It hung from his camel's saddle, worn and patched and faded by the sun. You had never looked inside it. No one had. Now, you brought it to him and opened the flap. Inside were the things you might have expected: a spare tinderbox, a bundle of dried meat, a small knife with a bone handle. But beneath these, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a leather cord, was a letter. Take it, the caravan master said. Take the key and the letter. If I die. You started to protest, but he raised a hand. The gesture was weak, but the authority behind it was not. If I die, he continued, you must deliver that letter to the westernmost port. The one on the edge of the maps. Do you understand? You asked him which port. What was its name? How would you find it? The caravan master closed his eyes. For a long moment, he was silent. The fire crackled at the entrance of the tent. Outside, a camel groaned in its sleep. The wind stirred the canvas walls with a soft, rhythmic whisper, like the breath of the mountains themselves. When you reach it, he said at last, you will know. And you will know who to give the letter to. He did not explain further. Instead, he reached beneath his pillow and withdrew a roll of parchment, yellowed with age and soft at the edges. A map. He pressed it into your hands. You unrolled it carefully, holding it close to the lamp. The map showed a route you had never seen before, a line that began in the familiar cities of the East, passed through the lands you knew, and then kept going. West. Past Constantinople. Past the islands of the Greeks. Past the Italian peninsula. The line continued until it reached the very edge of the parchment, where the ink faded into a thin, wavering trail and then stopped. Beyond that, there was nothing but blank, unmarked space. He gave me this map 40 years ago, the caravan master said. His voice was growing fainter now, each word a little harder to hear than the last. I never finished the journey. I think I was waiting for someone who could. Someone who would not turn back. He looked at you, and his eyes, though dimmed by illness, still held something of their old fire. Someone like you. He died before dawn. You buried him on a hill overlooking the mountain pass, marking the grave with a cairn of stones. Then you mounted your camel, the bone key around your neck and the letter in you. Our saddlebag and the map folded against your chest. You did not know where you were going. But for the first time in your life, you knew that you were meant to go there. The fire had burned so low now that it was little more than a faint orange glow against the darkness. You watched the last embers pulse and fade, each one a tiny heartbeat of light that flared for a moment and then vanished. The cold desert wind stirred the sand at your feet, and the old camel shifted in her sleep, her breath coming in long, slow sighs. The gold coin was still in your hand, warm from the heat of your palm, its strange symbol pressed against your skin. But your mind was no longer in the present. It was traveling back again, across the years, to the road to Antioch. To the storm. To the darkness. And to what you found when the darkness lifted. The caravan had been traveling for weeks through the Syrian desert, a vast and empty stretch of land where the sun beat down by day with the weight of a hammer and the cold crept in by night like a thief. The landscape was barren and beautiful, rolling dunes of pale gold, rocky outcrops that jutted from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast, salt flats that glittered in the sun like fields of crushed glass. You had crossed this desert before, many times, but never with so few men and so much weight on your heart. The caravan master was dead. You had buried him with your own hands on a hillside overlooking a mountain pass, piling stones over his body to keep the jackals away. The map he had given you was folded in your saddlebag, its edges soft with age. The bone key hung around your neck, hidden beneath your robe, its carved flowers and stars pressing gently against your skin with every step your camel took. And the letter that he had told you to deliver to the westernmost port, the one on the edge of the maps, was pressed against your chest, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a leather cord that you had not loosened since the night he died. You had not opened it. He had not told you to open it. And you were a man who followed orders. It was as simple as that. But there were nights, sitting bayside. The fire much like this one, when you felt the weight of the unopened letter and wondered what it contained. A secret. A name. A final message from the man who had shaped your entire life. You had carried it for weeks now, through mountain passes and across dry riverbeds, and it had become a part of you, a quiet, constant presence that you could feel even when you were not thinking about it. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was clear and blue, the sun blazing overhead with the fierce, unblinking intensity of the desert noon. The caravan was spread out along a shallow wadi, the camels plodding slowly through the soft sand, their bells clinking with each step. You were riding near the front, your eyes half closed against the glare, your mind drifting somewhere far away. The next moment, a dark wall of sand was racing toward you across the horizon, swallowing the blue sky and the golden dunes and the white sun all at once. It rose up like a mountain, like a wave, like the end of the world. Someone shouted. A camel bellowed. And then the wind hit. It was not like ordinary wind. It was a blast of hot, dry air that knocked you sideways in your saddle and sent the camels stumbling backward, their eyes rolling white with panic. Then came the sand. It was not like ordinary sand. It was a suffocating cloud of fine, abrasive dust that filled your mouth and nose and eyes in an instant, that scraped against your skin like 1,000 tiny knives, that turned the day into night. You pulled your scarf over your face and shouted for the others to take cover, but your voice was swallowed by the roar. You could hear nothing. You could see nothing. The world had been reduced to a swirling, screaming darkness, and there was nothing in it but you and the sand and the letter pressed against your heart. You did not know how long the storm lasted. Time had no meaning in that darkness. But at some point, in the midst of the wind and the sand and the chaos, you heard something else. Shouts. The clash of metal. The high, piercing screams of men and camels. Raiders. They had used the storm as cover, moving through the blinding sand like sharks through dark water, and they were among the caravan before anyone could draw a weapon or raise a shield. You did not fight. You were not a fighter. You had never been a fighter. You were a scribe, a courier, a man who carried secrets and records and promises. Yes. Your weapons were ink and paper, not steel. So you did the only thing you could do. You slid from your camel's back, crawled beneath her belly, pressed your body flat against the sand, and held the letter against your heart with both hands. You stayed there, motionless, as the chaos raged around you. You stayed there as the shouts grew louder and then began to fade. You stayed there as the storm began to weaken, the wind losing its fury, the sand settling back to the earth like a slow, dry rain. You stayed there until the only sound was the labored breathing of the surviving camels and the soft, mournful whistle of the wind through the rocks. When you finally raised your head, the caravan was gone. The raiders had taken what they wanted, the camels, the goods, the water, the weapons. They had left behind the dead and the dying. A third of the men who had set out with you that morning would never see another dawn. The rest were scattered, lost somewhere in the vast emptiness of the desert, their fates unknown. You had survived. Your camel had survived. And the letter was still pressed against your chest, unopened, unharmed. You could feel its shape beneath your robe, solid and real, a small, quiet miracle in the midst of so much loss. You walked for 2 days before you reached Antioch. 2 days of stumbling through the sand, your camel limping beside you, your water skin nearly empty, your lips cracked and bleeding. The sun beat down by day, and the cold crept in by night, and you kept walking. You kept walking because there was nothing else to do. You kept walking because the caravan master had trusted you. Because the letter was still in your robe. Because the road did not end here. Antioch rose before you on the evening of the second day, its walls glowing gold in the light of the setting sun. It was an ancient city, a city of empires and apostles, its streets paved with stones that had been worn smooth by the feet of Romans and Greeks and Persians and 100 other peoples who had passed through before you. You found an inn near the eastern gate, a small, quiet place with a courtyard and a fountain where water trickled over worn stones with a sound like quiet laughter. You rented a room, a simple space with a bed and a table and a single window that looked out over the rooftops. You lit a candle. You sat on the bed. And for the first time since the caravan master had placed the letter in your hands on the night he died, you broke the seal. The wax crumbled beneath your thumb. You unfolded the oilcloth. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, folded once. No. Not a sheet. There was nothing written on it. No words. No names. No instructions. Just a small, dry twig of olive, brittle with age, its leaves long since crumbled to dust. You held it up to the candlelight, turning it over in your fingers. It meant nothing to you. It was just a piece of a tree, a fragment of something that had once been alive. And yet, The caravan master had guarded it with his life. He had made you promise to carry it to the edge of the known world. He had given you a map and a bone key and this small, fragile thing, and he had told you that you would know what to do when the time came. But the time had not yet come. You wrapped the olive branch back in its cloth and placed it gently in your saddlebag, beside the map and the bone key and the gold coin you had carried for so long. Several nights later, deep in the stillness of the early morning hours, someone knocked on your door. 3 soft taps, spaced evenly, the same rhythm that the widow in Merv had used all those years ago. The same rhythm that you had heard outside your tent in Bokhara, outside your room in Tabriz, outside a dozen doors in a dozen cities. You rose from your bed, your heart steady, your hands calm. You opened the door. A man stood in the shadows of the hallway, his face half hidden by the hood of his cloak. He did not speak. He simply raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, and showed you a ring. Silver. Worn smooth by years of wear. Engraved on the inside, you knew without looking, were 2 Hebrew letters and a small, precise symbol. A key. The same ring you wore on your own finger. The same ring the Jewish doctor in Constantinople had given you, years ago. I know what you carry, the stranger said. His voice was low and quiet, barely above a whisper. Not money. Not gold. An olive branch. He paused, and in the dim light of the candle you saw his eyes. They were calm and steady, the eyes of someone who had been waiting for a very long time. I have been looking for you, he said. Or someone like you. Someone who carries the branch. He did not speak as if he was asking. He spoke as if he had known you were coming. As if the road you had traveled, with all its dangers and losses and secrets, had been leading you to this door all along. The fire was little more than ash now, a faint memory of warmth in the cold desert night. The stars above you had wheeled slowly across the sky, and the crescent moon hung low on the horizon, pale as a sliver of bone. You had been sitting here for hours, the gold coin in your palm, the silver ring on your finger, the weight of 30 years pressing gently on your chest. And as the last ember winked out and the darkness gathered around you, your mind drifted across the sea. To the island of Crete. To the city of Candia. To the monk who had saved your soul. You had arrived in Candia on a Venetian galley in the spring of your 43rd year. The city rose from the harbor in layers of honey-colored stone, Venetian ramparts and Greek bell towers and Ottoman minarets all jumbled together like the pieces of a puzzle that no one had quite solved. The air was thick with salt and the cry of gulls, and the narrow streets were crowded with merchants selling olives and silk and spices from the far corners of the earth. It was a city of borders and crossings, of languages that mingled and overlapped, of secrets that moved through the shadows like fish through dark water. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place where a man like you could disappear. You had been on the island for nearly a year when you first met Father Andreas. He was the caretaker of a small stone chapel on the eastern edge of the city, a crumbling Byzantine structure dedicated to Saint Nicholas, the patron of sailors and travelers and those who had no home but the sea. The chapel was ancient even by the standards of this ancient island. Its walls were covered with frescoes that had been painted centuries ago, ships struggling against stormy seas, saints with halos of flaking gold, Christ calming the waters with a raised hand that had long since lost most of its fingers to time and damp. Father Andreas had been its caretaker for more than 50 years. He was older than anyone you had ever seen, his back bent with age, his hands gnarled like the roots of an olive tree. His eyes were pale and watery, but when he looked at you, you felt as if he could see straight through to the secrets you carried. You had come to the chapel seeking shelter from a sudden storm, nothing more. But Father Andreas had invited you to sit, had offered you bread and olives and a cup of thin wine, had asked you where you had come from and where you were going. And before you knew what was happening, you were telling him. Not everything, not at first. But enough. Enough that he understood that you were not an ordinary traveler. Enough that he knew you carried things that were not meant to be seen. It was on your 5th visit to the chapel that you told him the whole truth. You had been traveling again, carrying messages between the Jewish community in Candia and their relatives in Rhodes, and the weight of the work had settled into your bones like a cold fog. You found yourself sitting in the chapel after Vespers, alone with the old monk, the light of a single lamp casting long shadows on the stone walls. And you began to speak. Not in the measured, careful tones you used with merchants and couriers, but freely, openly, as if a dam had broken somewhere inside you and the words were pouring out before you could stop them. You told him about the Caravan master and the shadow ledger. You told him about the network of couriers and merchants and widows who carried coins and secrets across the known world. You told him about the gold of Constantinople, and the doctor with his silver ring, and the stranger in Antioch who had known about the olive branch before you had spoken a word. And then you told him what you had done with that network in the years since the caravan master's death. How you had used it not just to move money, but to move people. Refugees. Fugitives. Men and women who had crossed borders in the dead of night, guided by strangers who asked no questions and expected no payment. You had hidden them in caravans. You had forged documents using the same careful handwriting your father had taught you. You had bribed guards with coins from the same pouches that had once held payments for silk and saffron. You had done all of this, you said, because the ledger had taught you that money was only as good as the people it helped. And you had helped as many as you could. Father Andreas listened. He sat perfectly still in his wooden chair, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on your face. The lamp flickered between you, sending shadows dancing across the frescoed walls. Outside, the sea murmured against the harbor walls, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to breathe with the chapel itself. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He simply listened, with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime hearing confessions, and who knew that some truths could not be hurried. When you finally fell silent, the monk was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand on top of yours. His skin was cool and dry, thin as parchment. You could feel the bones beneath it, delicate as a bird's. "The book," he said. "The one with the names. Do you still have it?" You nodded. It was in your saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath a false panel you had sewn into the leather yourself, many years ago. "Bring it to me," he said. "I will keep it safe. No one will look for it here. No one will find it. You hesitated. The ledger was the most precious thing you owned. It was the record of every transaction, every name, every debt and payment and promise that had passed through your hands in the course of a lifetime. But Father Andreas was looking at you with his pale, steady eyes, and something in those eyes told you that he understood. That he knew what the book meant. That he would guard it as if it were his own soul. You brought him the ledger the next morning, just as the sun was rising over the eastern hills. The chapel was empty and quiet, the smell of incense still hanging in the air from the morning liturgy. Father Andreas took the book without a word. He carried it to the altar, knelt with a soft groan of old bones, and wrapped it carefully in a piece of cloth that he took from beneath the altar itself, a cloth that had covered the sacred vessels, the chalice and the paten, the body and blood of Christ. Then he walked to the far wall, where a single brick had worked itself loose over the centuries. He slid the brick out, placed the wrapped ledger into the hollow space behind it, and slid the brick back into place. It fit perfectly. No one would ever know it was there. "It will be safe here," he said. "No one will look. No one will find it. Go now. Continue your work. And when the work is done, come back. The book will be waiting." For 10 years, the ledger stayed in that wall. And for 10 years, you continued your work, carrying messages and money and the occasional fugitive across the borders of the Venetian Empire, from Crete to Cyprus, from Rhodes to the coast of Anatolia. You returned to Candia whenever you could, visiting Father Andreas in his small stone cell, sharing bread and wine and stories. He never spoke of the ledger. He never asked if you had read the names again. He simply kept it hidden, wrapped in the altar cloth, in the darkness behind the stone, and he waited. Let these names rest now in the quiet of your mind. Father Andreas has been at Ace for a long time. The ledger has been sealed away. You don't need to remember them all tonight. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the sea carry you for a while, gentle and slow, like a prayer spoken on the water. Father Andreas died in the winter of your 11th year on the island. You were not there when it happened. You were in Rhodes, delivering a letter to a family who had been waiting 3 years for news of their son. When you returned to Candia in the spring, a young novice met you at the harbor. He was thin and pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he pressed a small package into your hands, wrapped in brown paper and tied with rough twine. "Father Andreas asked me to give this to you," he said. "He told me you would come. He said you had been coming for a very long time." You opened the package there on the dock, with the salt wind in your face and the gulls crying overhead. Inside was the ledger, its leather cover more worn than ever, its pages still intact, still filled with the names and numbers you had written so carefully so long ago. And tucked into the front cover, folded into a small square, was a slip of paper. The handwriting was Father Andreas's, a careful, spidery script that trembled slightly with the effort of old age. The note was brief. Just one line. "God keeps finer books than you." Beneath the words, pressed into the paper with a seal of red wax, was a symbol. A circle. And inside the circle, a key. The same symbol that was stamped on your gold coin. The same symbol that was engraved inside your silver ring. The same symbol you had seen on the edge of the caravan master's parchment map, on the night he had sent you west. The map had shown the road to the westernmost port, but it had never shown this, a mark on a monk's final note, on an island in the middle of the sea, hidden in plain sight for 10 years. The place that was not marked on the map was not a port at all. It was here. It had always been here. And now, at last, you knew where to look. The fire was gone now. Only the faintest trace of warmth lingered in the sand where the embers had been, a memory of heat that was already fading into the cold desert night. You did not reach for more wood. There was no more wood to reach for. The few sticks of acacia you had gathered from the wadi that afternoon had long since turned to ash, and you were too old now to go searching for more in the dark. The camel slept on behind you, her breathing slow and steady, a rhythm that had become as familiar to you as your own heartbeat. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, silent dance, the camel, the scales, the river, the same constellations that had watched over you since you were a boy sitting on the steps of a mosque in Samarkand. And you, wrapped in your worn wool blanket, the gold coin in your palm and the silver ring on your finger, were ready to look at the ledger one last time. The book lay in your saddlebag, wrapped in the same oilcloth that had protected it for 30 years. The cloth was stiff now, its fibers cracked and frayed at the edges, but it still served its purpose. You reached for it slowly, carefully, the way you might reach for something sacred. Your hands were old. The joints ached with a deep, familiar pain, the kind that settled into the bones on cold nights and never quite left. The skin was loose and spotted with age, and the veins stood out like blue cords beneath the surface, tracing the paths of a lifetime's work. But your hands still remembered how to hold this book. They still knew the weight of it, the texture of its worn leather cover, the way the pages felt beneath your fingertips, soft and slightly rough, like the wing of a very old moth. You drew the ledger out and set it on your lap, resting it gently on the wool blanket that covered your knees. The cover was worn almost smooth in places, the dark leather burnished by years of handling. It was stained with the blood of Tabriz, a dark, rust-colored blotch that had never quite faded, and with the salt of the sea from your voyage to Candia, and with the fine, pale dust of 100 roads, 100 cities, 100 journeys that no one would ever remember but you. You ran your palm over the cover, feeling its familiar texture, its familiar weight. This book had been your companion for more than half your life. It had seen things that no other living soul had seen. And tonight, you were going to open it one last time. You opened the cover. The spine gave a soft creak, a sound as familiar as your own breathing. The pages crackled gently as you turned them, the old paper dry and brittle at the edges. You turned through them one by one, slowly, letting your eyes drift over the names and numbers you had written so carefully, so long ago. Names you had almost forgotten. Numbers that had once meant everything. The widow in Merv, who had come to your door in the middle of the night and pressed a pouch of coins into your hand. The merchant in Bokhara, who had given you a bundle of raw silk and pointed to a name in the book without speaking a word. The Armenian monk in Tabriz, who had slipped a folded piece of paper into your sleeve in the crowded market. The doctor in Constantinople, who had given you the silver ring you still wore. The stranger in Antioch, who had known about the olive branch before you had spoken. The fugitives you had guided through the borders, men and women and children whose names you had never learned, whose faces you could barely remember, but whose lives had been changed by the network you had helped to build. Page after page. Year after year. The ink had faded over the decades from black to a soft, watery brown, but every entry was still legible. Every name. Every amount. Every quiet notation in the margin, paid. Received. Debt clear. Written in your own careful hand. You had been faithful to this book. You had never missed an entry. You had never lost a name. And now, as you turned the pages, you felt a quiet sense of peace settling over you, like the desert cold settling into the sand. The work was done. The names were recorded. The debts were paid. And then you reached the last page. The blank page. It had always been blank. You had left it that way on purpose, all those years ago, because every ledger needs a final page, and you had not yet decided what to write there. You had thought, when you were younger, that you would fill it with a final entry, a summa. Of all the transactions, a closing balance, a note to whoever might find the book after you were gone. But as the years passed, you had left it empty. You did not know why. Perhaps you were waiting for something. Perhaps you sensed that the last page was not meant for numbers at all. The gold coin was still in your hand. You had been holding it all this time, feeling its familiar weight, tracing the raised edges of the symbol stamped on its face, the key inside the circle. You had carried this coin for 30 years, and in all that time, you had never understood what it was for. You had found it in a leather pouch the caravan master had given you, sealed with wax that you had not broken until tonight. You had kept it because it seemed important. Because the symbol on its face matched the symbol on the map and the ring and the monk's final note. Because you had always known, somewhere deep in the quiet part of your mind, that it was waiting for something. Now, without quite knowing why, you placed the coin on the blank page. It sat there, heavy and golden, catching the last light of the candle you had lit beside your blanket. The flame flickered in the faint desert breeze, and the coin seemed to glow, the gold warming to a deep, honeyed amber. You looked at it for a long moment. The key inside the circle. The symbol that had followed you across the world. And then you noticed something that you had never noticed before. The candlelight was shining through the coin. Not through the metal itself, gold does not let light pass, but through the thinness of the coin's edge, where the metal was slightly translucent after years of wear. And in that faint, filtered glow, you saw a shadow on the paper beneath the coin. The symbol on the coin was casting a shadow through the thin gold, and that shadow aligned perfectly with a pattern in the paper itself, a watermark, pressed into the page when the paper was made, invisible in ordinary light. The key inside the circle matched the watermark exactly, line for line, curve for curve, as if they had been made for each other. As if they had been waiting for this moment for 30 years. You lifted the coin. The watermark vanished. You placed it back down. The watermark returned. You did this several times, your old hand steady despite the trembling of your heart. There was no doubt. The coin and the page were connected. But how? And why? Your eyes moved from the watermark to the cover of the ledger, and there, on the front, in the corner, near the spine, you noticed something else. A small indentation in the leather. You had seen it 1,000 times and thought nothing of it. A flaw. A mark left by years of wear and tear. You had run your fingers over it absently while reading, while thinking, while waiting for contacts in caravanserais and coffeehouses. But now, with the coin in your hand and the watermark fresh in your mind, you looked at it more closely. The indentation was not random. It was shaped. Round. With a slot in the center. A slot the exact size and shape of the gold coin. Your breath caught in your throat. You held the coin up to the indentation, comparing the size, the shape, the fit. They matched. They matched perfectly. With fingers that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of the moment, you pressed the coin into the indentation. It slid into place with a soft, satisfying click, the sound of something that had been waiting a very long time to be made whole. And then the cover split open. Not along the spine, the binding remained intact, but along its inner edge, where the leather had been folded over the board. A hidden compartment. A seam so fine that it had been invisible to the naked eye, sealed by years of pressure and the natural adhesion of old leather. But the coin had released it. The coin was the key. It had always been the key. Inside the compartment, folded into a tiny square no larger than your thumbnail, was a letter. Not the letter the caravan master had given you on his deathbed. Not the olive branch wrapped in oilcloth that you still carried in your saddlebag. This was older. Much older. The parchment was yellow and brittle, the edges crumbling slightly at your touch. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the words were still legible. You unfolded it with the gentleness of a man who had spent his life handling fragile things, old paper, old promises, old secrets. The letter was addressed to no one and everyone. The handwriting was not the caravan master's. It was older than that. Finer. The script of a professional scribe, someone who had been trained in the great libraries of Baghdad or the imperial courts of Constantinople. The letters were formed with a precision and elegance that you had rarely seen, even in the finest manuscripts you had encountered in your travels. The message was brief. Just a few lines. Bearer of this letter is a courier. Deliver it to the end of the road. Ask nothing. Take nothing. The message is the messenger. You read the words twice. 3 times. They did not change. The message is the messenger. You, the courier, the scribe, the keeper of the shadow ledger, were not just the bearer of a secret. You were the secret. Your life, your journey, your faithfulness to the book and the names and the promises, that was the message. It had always been the message. You folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the hidden compartment. Then you closed the ledger and held it against your chest, feeling its familiar weight, its familiar warmth. The fire was gone. The night was cold. But you were not cold. You had found what you had been carrying all along. Not a coin. Not a key. Not a destination. A purpose. A reason for the road. And as you sat there in the darkness, with the stars wheeling overhead and the old camel sleeping behind you and the desert breathing around you, you knew that the road was almost at its end. But the message would go on. It would always go on. Because the message was you. The fire was little more than a memory now. The cold of the desert night had settled deep into the sand, and the stars overhead were blazing with that particular brilliance that comes only in the hours before dawn. You had been sitting here for so long that your body felt like part of the landscape, a stone, a dune, a twisted acacia rooted in the earth. The gold coin was warm in your palm, and the silver ring was cool on your finger, and the hidden letter from the ledger lay folded in your lap. But there was one more thing. One more piece of the puzzle that you had carried for 30 years without knowing it. The bone key. You reached beneath your robe and lifted the cord from around your neck. The key swung gently in the darkness, its carved surface catching the faint light of the stars. You had worn it for so long that it had become a part of you, its weight against your chest as familiar as your own heartbeat. The caravan master had given it to you on his deathbed, pressed into your hands with the map and the letter and the olive branch. He had not told you what it opened. He had not told you why it was made of bone instead of iron. He had simply given it to you, and you had worn it, and you had waited. Now, for the first time in 30 years, you looked at it closely. Not with the casual glance of familiarity, but with the careful attention of someone who is searching for something. The carvings on its surface were intricate, flowers and stars and the crescent moon, winding around the shaft in spiraling patterns. You had always thought they were decoration. Just ornament. The beautiful work of some craftsman in a city you had never visited. But tonight, with the hidden letter fresh in your mind and the gold coin's secret revealed, you wondered if there was more to it than that. You turned the key over in your fingers. The bone was smooth and warm, polished by years of contact with your skin. The carvings caught the starlight, their edges soft but still distinct. And then you felt it. A seam. A line so fine that you had never noticed it before, running around the edge of the key's handle. It was not a crack. It was too regular for that. Too deliberate. It was a joint, two pieces of bone fitted together so precisely that they had seemed like one. You gripped the handle in one hand and the shaft in the other. The old bones in your fingers ached, but you ignored the pain. You twisted. Gently at first. Then a little harder. The seam resisted for a moment, sealed by years of pressure and the natural adhesion of old bone. Then, with a soft click that you felt more than heard, it gave way. The handle separated into two halves. And there, tucked inside a hollow space that had been carved into the center of the bone, was a piece of parchment. Tiny. Folded into a square no larger than your fingernail. You drew it out carefully, your breath catching in your throat, and unfolded it. It was a map. Or rather, it was the missing corner of a map. The corner that had been torn from the caravan master's parchment 30 years ago. The corner you had never been able to find. The paper was the same, yellowed and soft at the edges. The ink was the same, faded to a pale brown. And the lines on it matched the lines on the map perfectly, like two pieces of a puzzle that had been separated for a lifetime and were finally being reunited. You reached into your saddlebag and pulled out the map. Your hands were trembling now, not from cold but from the weight of the moment. You unfolded it carefully, spreading it across your lap, and fitted the missing corner into place. The tear in the parchment aligned with the edge of the fragment as if they had never been apart. The map was complete. And for the first time, you could see where the road ended. The line that had been traced across the map, the route you had followed for so many years, led west, always west, through cities you knew and cities you had never seen. But at the very edge of the parchment, where the ink had faded into a thin, wavering trail and then stopped, the missing corner revealed something new. A second line. Fainter than the first, drawn in a different hand, an older hand, the hand of whoever had drawn the map before the caravan master. This second line came from the north, winding down through mountains and rivers until it met the first line at a single point on the coast of a sea. The Black Sea. And the point where the two lines met was a port. The name was written in tiny, precise letters beside a small drawing of a harbor. Kaffa. You knew that name. Kaffa was the last port before the edge of the known war. LD. The Genoese had built it on the ruins of an older city, a trading post on the edge of the Great Steppe. Marco Polo had called it the end of the world. It was the place where the caravans from the east met the ships from the west. The place where silk and spices and gold changed hands. The place where secrets crossed from one world to another. And the olive branch, the dried, brittle twig that the caravan master had wrapped in oilcloth and pressed into your hands, had come from there. You could see it now. The map showed a small grove of olive trees just outside the city walls. The caravan master had been there. He had picked that branch himself. He had carried it across the world, just as you were carrying it now. And he had never told you. You looked up from the map. The fire was gone. The night was dark. But on the horizon, where the desert met the sky, a faint line of pale gray was beginning to appear. Dawn was coming. And with it, the road. The road that led west. The road that led to Kaffa. The road that had been waiting for you since before you were born. You folded the map carefully, tucked the bone key back around your neck, and began to prepare for the last leg of your journey. The fire was almost out, but you did not reach for more wood. You had been feeding this small flame all night, first with acacia sticks gathered from the wadi, then with memories drawn from the deepest wells of your heart, and finally with the quiet, steady warmth of a decision that had been building in your soul for 30 years. The last embers pulsed with a faint orange glow, like the slow breathing of some ancient creature sleeping beneath the sand. The cold of the desert night wrapped itself around your shoulders, but you did not mind. You had been cold before. You had been cold on the high passes of the Pamirs, where the wind cut like a blade. You had been cold on the Anatolian plateau, where the frost settled on your blanket and turned it stiff by morning. This was a gentle cold, a familiar cold, the kind that reminded you that you were still alive. The ledger lay open on your lap, its pages filled with the names and numbers that had been your life's work. You had turned through them one final time, letting your eyes drift over the familiar entries: the widow in Merv, the merchant in Bokhara, the monk in Tabriz, the doctor in Constantinople, the stranger in Antioch, the fugitives whose names you had never learned. Each entry was a story. Each story was a thread in the great tapestry of the network you had helped to build. And now, as the fire faded and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, silent dance, you closed the cover and rested your palm on the worn leather. The gold coin, its secret now revealed, rested on the blank last page where you had left it. The hidden letter from the ledger, bearer of this letter is a courier. The message is the messenger, was folded beside it. The bone key hung around your neck, its hollow handle once again sealed, the map fragment tucked safely inside. And the silver ring, the doctor's ring, the ring that had been worn smooth by years of promises kept, still circled your finger, its engraved key pressed gently against you. Our skin. You looked at all these things, these objects that had traveled with you across mountains and deserts and seas, and you understood what you had to do. The understanding did not come like a thunderclap. It came quietly, like the first light of dawn creeping over the dunes. It came like the voice of the caravan master, speaking to you from beyond the grave. It came like the handwriting of the monk in Candia, whose final note had pointed you toward this moment. You were not a banker. You had never been a banker. You were not a merchant, trading silk for silver and silver for gold. You were not a smuggler, though you had crossed borders with secrets hidden in your saddle and refugees hidden in your caravan. You were not even a scribe, though your hands had filled more pages than any scholar in the libraries of Baghdad. You were something else. Something rarer. You were a courier. A messenger. A man who carried things from one place to another, not for profit, not for glory, but because the things needed to be carried. The money had never been yours. The secrets had never been yours. They had passed through your hands like water through a wadi after a storm, and your job had simply been to keep them flowing. To keep them safe. To keep them moving. Now, your hands were old. The joints ached with a deep, familiar pain, and the skin was loose and spotted with age. Your body was tired, not the tiredness of a single long day on the road, but the tiredness of a lifetime of days, each one spent walking toward a horizon that never quite arrived. The road that had stretched before you for so many years was finally coming to an end. But the money and the secrets, they still had further to go. They were not meant to end with you. They were meant to continue, to flow westward, to reach the port of Kaffa and whatever lay beyond it. You reached into your saddlebag and pulled out the old oilcloth. It was the same cloth that had wrapped the ledger for 30 years, stained with the blood of Tabriz, darkened by the salt spray of the Mediterranean, dusted with the pale sand of 100 deserts. You spread it on the ground before you, smoothing out the wrinkles with your palm, feeling the familiar texture of its fibers. Then, one by one, you placed the objects upon it. First, the ledger. You lifted it with both hands, feeling its familiar weight, its familiar warmth. The leather cover was worn smooth in places, darkened by years of handling. Why? Oh, you held it for a long moment, remembering the first time the caravan master had placed it in your hands. You had been 14 years old. You had been sitting beside a fire much like this one. And he had told you that the book was more important than your life. He had been right. You set the ledger gently on the oilcloth, its cover facing upward, its pages closed. The names inside were not yours anymore. They had never been yours. They belonged to the people who had trusted you, the widows, the merchants, the refugees, the fugitives. They belonged to the network. And the network would continue. Second, the letter. The one the caravan master had given you on his deathbed, wrapped in its own oilcloth, tied with a leather cord. You had carried it across the Syrian desert, through the storm that had killed a third of your caravan. You had carried it to Antioch, where a stranger with a silver ring had told you he knew what you held. You had carried it across the sea to Candia, where an old monk had guarded your ledger for 10 years. You had never opened it until tonight. And what you had found inside was not a message at all, just a dried olive branch, brittle with age, its leaves long since crumbled to dust. But that olive branch was a message. It had always been a message. You placed the letter on top of the ledger, the oilcloth still wrapped around its fragile cargo. Someone else would carry it the rest of the way. Third, the bone key. You reached beneath your robe and lifted the cord from around your neck. The key swung gently in the cold desert air, its carved surface catching the faint light of the stars. You had worn it for 30 years, ever since the night the caravan master had pressed it into your hands with his dying breath. You had never known what it opened. You still did not know. But the map hidden inside its handle had shown you the way to Kaffa, and that was enough. You coiled the cord carefully and placed the key on top of the letter. It would open something, someday. It would find its lock. Fourth, the silver ring. You worked it from your finger. It was tight, after all these years, the skin around it slightly indented from decades of wear. It came loose with a little effort, sliding over your knuckle with a faint resistance. You held it in your palm for a long moment, feeling its lightness, its smoothness, the tiny engraved letters and the key symbol on its inner surface. You remembered the doctor in Constantinople who had given it to you, his hands trembling with age. You remembered the stranger in Antioch who had shown you its twin. You remembered the monk in Candia, whose final note had borne the same symbol. All the people who had worn rings like this one. All the promises that had been kept. Then you placed the ring on the pile. You looked at the 4 objects, the ledger, the letter, the key, the ring, and you felt a quiet sense of peace settle over you. They were not yours anymore. They had never been yours. They were the tools of the network. And the network was bigger than any one courier. It would continue without you. You folded the oilcloth over the objects, tucking the edges in carefully, the way you might wrap a newborn child against the cold. You tied the bundle with a leather cord, pulling the knots tight and secure, testing them with your fingers. The package was small but heavy, heavy with years, heavy with secrets, heavy with promises that had not yet been fulfilled. You held it in your lap, feeling its weight, and you made a quiet vow to the dying fire and the silent stars. Not an oath of loyalty or obedience. Those oaths you had already sworn, long ago, to the caravan master on a hillside in the mountains. This was something different. This was a vow of release. You were letting go. You were passing the burden to the next pair of hands. Now you can close your eyes. You have walked further than most men ever will. You have carried more than most men could bear. The fire will burn itself out. The rest belongs to the wind and the camel's footprints and the long, slow turning of the stars above you. Let the weight lift. Let the silence hold you. Sleep, if you can. The road will still be here when you wake. And then, faint and far away, carried on the cold desert wind, you heard a sound. A sound you had heard 1,000 times before, on 100 different roads, in 12 different countries. It was a sound that had been the background music of your entire life, the rhythm of arrival and departure, of greeting and farewell. Bells. Camel bells. Their chime was slow and steady, a pattern of 3 notes followed by a pause, then 3 notes again. They were growing louder with each passing moment, carried across the silent dunes by the same wind that stirred the sand at your feet. You looked up. The sky was beginning to pale in the east, the first faint blush of dawn creeping over the edge of the dunes like a whispered promise. The stars were fading, one by one, retreating into the deep blue of the coming day. And there, cresting the ridge of the nearest dune, their silhouette, sharp and dark against the lightning sky, was a line of camels. A caravan. Perhaps 12 animals, their heads bobbing gently with each step, their packs laden with goods bound for markets in the west. The lead rider held a lantern in his hand, an old-fashioned oil lantern with a glass shade, its flame steady and bright despite the wind. The lantern swung gently with the motion of his camel, and the light traced small circles in the gray pre-dawn air, like a star that had descended from the heavens and chosen to walk among men. You watched it approach, and you felt your heart beat a little faster. You did not know who this rider was. You did not know where he was going. But you knew, with a certainty that went deeper than words, that he was the one you had been waiting for. The one who would carry the bundle westward. The one who would finish what you had started. The road was not ending. It was only changing hands. And the message would go on. The caravan crested the dunes slowly, the camels picking their way down the soft sand with the careful, deliberate grace of creatures who had walked these deserts for 1,000 generations. The lead rider held his lantern high, its flame steady and golden in the gray pre-dawn light. Behind him, 12 other camels followed, their packs laden with goods bound for markets in the west, silk from the east, spices from the south, and the quiet, invisible cargo of secrets that every caravan carried whether it knew it or not. You stood. Your old bones protested, the knees, the back, the shoulders that had carried so much for so long, but you stood. The bundle was in your hands. The oilcloth was rough against your palms, and the weight of the ledger and the letter and the key and the ring pressed down with the gravity of 30 years. You walked forward, your feet sinking slightly into the cold sand, and you met the lead rider at the edge of your small camp. He was younger than you. They were all younger than you now. His beard was black, streaked with the pale dust of the road, and his eyes were dark and steady. He wore the layered robes of a desert traveler, wool over cotton over linen, and his hands on the reins were weathered but strong. He looked at you, and he looked at the bundle in your hands, and he did not ask what it was. He had been on the road long enough to know that some things are not meant to be explained. You held out the bundle. He took it. His hands were warm, and for a moment, your fingers touched his. Then he untied the leather cord and folded back the oilcloth. He looked at the ledger, the letter, the key. His expression did not change. But when he saw the bone key, the carved flowers and stars, the crescent moon on its handle, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. He lifted the key from the bundle and turned it over in his fingers. Then he slipped the cord over his head and let the key fall against his chest, just as you had worn it for 30 years. He looked at you. You looked at him. No words passed between you. None were needed. He nodded once, a small, solemn inclination of his head, and then he turned his camel and rode back to the caravan. The other riders fell into line behind him. The camels lurched forward, their bells chiming softly with each step. And the caravan continued west, toward the sea, toward Kaffa, toward the end of the road. You watched them go. You stood there, alone beside the remains of your fire, and you watched the line of camels grow smaller and smaller against the pale dawn sky. They crested the next dune. The lantern light flickered once, twice, and then it was gone, swallowed by the distance. The sound of the bells faded, and then the silence returned. You sat down. The last piece of acacia wood was still in your hand, a small, gnarled branch that you had been saving for no reason you could name. You placed it gently on the embers. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a tiny flame licked up from the coals, curling around the wood, and the fire came back to life. Just a small fire. Just a handful of flames. But it was enough to light your face, to trace the deep lines around your eyes and the gentle curve of your mouth. You were smiling. You had not known you were smiling until you felt the warmth of the fire on your skin. But you were smiling. The sky was growing lighter now, the deep indigo of the desert night giving way to a soft, pearlescent gray. The stars were fading, one by one. The camel, your old companion, stirred behind you and let out a low, rumbling breath. The fire crackled softly, and you closed your eyes. You thought about the road. Not the road ahead, there was no road ahead for you now. But the road behind. The road you had walked for more than 60 years. From Samarkand to Bukhara. From Tabriz to Constantinople. From Antioch to Candia. Across mountains and deserts and seas. You had carried so much. And now, you had let it go. The flames began to die again. The last piece of wood burned down to embers, and the embers crumbled into ash. A cold breeze stirred the sand, and the ash lifted, swirling gently into the air like a page torn from a ledger, drifting upward into the pale morning sky. You watched it rise, and you felt your breathing slow, your body sinking deeper into the sand, your hands resting quietly on your knees. The fire was out. The courier's work was done. And somewhere, far to the west, a letter was still traveling. A ledger was still traveling. A bone key and a silver ring were still traveling, carried by hands that had never known your name but would carry the message all the same. You had been one link in a chain. And the chain would continue without you. The sun touched the edge the dunes. The sky turned gold. And you, the courier of the Silk Road, closed your eyes for the last time, as the desert wrapped itself around you like a blanket, and the wind whispered through the sand, and the long, slow silence of the ages settled over everything. Good night.